Chapter 22. Pinky's Port. "Why do they call it Pinky's Port?" Haille asked, trudging through mounds of grass bent low by an afternoon rain. "Because of where it sits on the shore of the Hand Sea," Val said, a blade of grass dangling from his mouth. "The sea is shaped like a hand, with a thumb stretching south from the palm towards Kerith, and the pinky pointing north towards Sidon," Katlyn finished for him. When Val turned to look at her, she shrugged her shoulders. "I read about it." "Sort of an unoriginal name," Haille said. "Like naming someone after Haille?" Katlyn said with a smirk. Even Val snorted, but his laughter was cut short as the jays passed overhead chirping. Adamantus followed in their wake from the south. "Our scout returns," Cody said, struggling to pull his boot out of a pocket of mud. "Hopefully he brings news that the grand port of the littlest finger is near." "I do," the elk said. "The port is less than a league away. Once past those trees, you will be able to see its buildings. But the outskirts are crowded with refugees from the fighting in the south." "They've probably doubled the population of the town," Cody said, shaking his foot free of the mud. "More likely quadrupled," the elk said. "There are more people in camps and the surrounding woods than in the town itself." "Might be best if you stayed on the periphery, grazing or doing something, elk-like," Val said. "You might draw too much attention if you come trotting into town with us." "Haille can send the jays to me if you need my aid," the elk said. Haille's hair stood on end. The unnatural thrill of hearing his name spoken from the mouth of an elk had not worn away. Was this how it felt to commoners when his father uttered their name? They continued through the boggy grass for a few more minutes before emerging in the copse of trees the elk had spoken of. True to his word, the woods were crowded with ragged people, mostly women and children and the old, their clothes dirty and threadbare, their faces drawn and lean, their eyes sunken with dark circles beneath. They offered sparse greetings, staring with suspicion mixed with expectation, for Haille and his company were clearly travelers, and perhaps brought provisions to share or trade, or, if nothing else, news. "Cody," Val said as they passed a clutch of starving children, "give them some food and water. Discreetly now. We don't want to start a riot." The children ate the stale bread as if it were honey cakes. Haille felt awkward and somewhat guilty in their presence, simply for not being more gaunt. The road had been hard on him, leaning him out so that he had been forced to buckle his belt a notch tighter, but he felt absolutely fat next to these skeletal creatures. He swung his rucksack off and shared some hard bread with some other children who wandered up. It did not take long for them to be overwhelmed by the numbers. Even adults began to crowd around with outstretched hands. "Come on," Val finally said. "We need to get to town." They approached the port with somber hearts. The face of war was not what Haille had expected. Violence, bloodshed, dented shields, and broken swords, even the carcasses of the vanquished he could have imagined and steeled himself for. But not the empty eyes and swollen bellies of innocent children, even their parents reduced to beggars, sleeping on the forest floor, leaves and twigs in their matted hair. The privation was even more widespread when they reached the makeshift camp that surrounded the port town. These refugees were slightly better off than those living in the forest. They had tents, at least, even if those tents were overcrowded with dozens of adults, children, and their elders. Pots hung over fire pits, but it was dubious if anything but water boiled in them. The smell of feces was rank, and if the bloody flux had not taken hold yet of these people's guts, it soon would. Here and there a drunk man, either too old to fight or too cowardly, staggered past. Some shouted raucous greetings at Katlyn. Others stared at the group of them in stony silence. Cody walked with his hand on his sword hilt, the space between him and Haille and Katlyn small. The port town proper was a mishmash of more established stone buildings, with 2- or 3-storied wooden ones, none of which appeared to be straight. There were tile roofs alongside thatch ones, all with smoking chimneys. At any other time, Pinky's port would have displayed all the signs of prosperity. A forest of masts at the docks, dozens upon dozens of wagons lining the streets, and a population of able-bodied men. But with the war raging in the southern reaches of the kingdom, the ship masts were naked, the wagons empty, and the longshoremen and sailors idle on the galleries of crowded taverns, playing dice, drinking grog, or shouting insults. Katlyn leaned in close to Haille as a fight broke out in one tavern and spilled into the street. The combatants were two leathery-looking sailors, pitted against two burly longshoremen. Their appetite for violence was extinguished as soon as they tumbled into the muddy road, tripping drunkenly over one another. Soon there was laughter, and former adversaries were offering each other a hand up. "Idle hands," Cody said. "They're no harm to you, lass. I grew up in such towns. They have a certain charm." "If you say so," Katlyn said. Val came to a stop outside a tavern with a hanging sign waving in the breeze off the sea. Painted on it was a pelican with an infant riding in its pouched beak. Faded letters running above and below read, "The Bird and the Baby Tavern." "This is it," Val said, making his way up the stairs to the gallery where a number of sailors regarded him with bloodshot eyes. One spat, another tapped the ashes out of his pipe, a third sipped the last of his grog and slammed down his mug. "We're going in there?" Katlyn asked, stopping on the steps, her nose wrinkling. Val answered with a nod and made a clicking noise with his mouth before stepping into the doorway. "At least we'll be out of the street," Haille said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. Cody slapped them both on their backs. "Looks like a fine establishment. We'll get a good meal and maybe a bed for the night." "Long as I don't have to share it with a stranger," Katlyn said. "Well, that is part of the fun, isn't it?" "Very funny." "Don't worry. Val and I are looking out for you both. Just follow your old friend Cody's lead." They did, passing through the doorway which was covered by the stretched and fading remains of a sailcloth. A fierce-looking man on the other side, bald with a star-shaped scar on his temple, stopped them and required them to check their weapons behind a counter. Even Haille and Katlyn were required to hand over their swords, the man raising an eyebrow when he looked upon the craftsmanship of Elkhart. The smells of dirt, ash, pine tar, and spilled ale mingled in the air, which was hazy with pipe smoke. But above all the smells were the welcoming aromas of fresh bread and cooking stew. Haille's stomach grumbled at the prospect of food, and he followed Cody to a table. It was not the choicest of place settings. The top was sticky and stained and covered in a sprinkling of crumbs. It was also far from the warmth of the fire. All those spots were taken by sailors, and the chairs rocked on uneven legs. But Haille was happy to sit, his muscles relaxing as he did so. The tavern was modest. The walls were constructed from ship timbers, the beams overhead supported by repurposed keels. A single tavern maid made rounds among the patrons, rough-looking men who, in the comfort and darkness of the interior, were boisterous and loud. The maid was a lithe brunette, with a shock of white running through her bangs and tattoos from her wrist to her neck. Bangles jingled on her arms and ankles. Haille thought her harsh-looking, as any woman used to working amid such clientele might, but upon laying eyes on Cody, her face softened, and she even moved to straighten a loose lock of hair from her face. Cody winked at her, and she smiled. "No shenanigans, soldier. We're on a mission," Val reminded him under his breath. "Just enticing the lady over to take our orders," Cody said, leaning forward in his seat as the woman came alongside their table. Misty, as she introduced herself, brought them jugs of cider, a wheel of cheese, and a hot loaf of bread while they waited for their stew. Katlyn jumped, nearly spilling her drink when the sailors began a cheer without warning. Across the room, a slender, short man was walking onto a stage in the corner of the main room. He was reed-like, especially in comparison to the burly figures in the audience. Unlike the weather-beaten sailors, his face was smooth-shaven, his hands diminutive and unscarred. He was handsome in a plain way, despite a nose that was a bit large for his face and a hairline that was receding. He introduced himself as Gunther and asked the audience their leave to demonstrate some tricks.
"Make yourself disappear,"
a gruff voice called out, followed by coarse laughter. Gunther offered an uncomfortable smile. Haille noticed Katlyn shoot the speaker a reproachful look. He was a bald man with a ring in his nose that connected to one in his ear via a tiny gold chain. Katlyn had taken to this meek-looking man, striving to entertain a room full of louts, and she did not like the rude comments. Haille knew that in a bigger city, this Gunther might find a better audience on a street corner than a tavern such as this. But Gunther did not disappoint. His first few tricks were of the common variety. He made eggs appear between his fingers, performed a card trick, swallowed a long, thin sword. All of this won him a smattering of applause. It was when he tied a rope around his neck and, with a flourish, pulled it tight, only to have it fall loose as if it had passed through him, that the men sat up. At first, they were too shocked to even applaud. Instead, they laughed and whispered among themselves, before offering some tentative cheers, unsure of what they had just seen. But their response heartened Gunther, giving him confidence to speak louder. His eyes were brighter, his smile a bit wider, and the flourish of his arms grander. Misty brought their bowls of stew, but Haille barely noticed his and left it to cool, afraid he would miss a trick if he took his eyes away from Gunther. The feats were growing in complexity. Gunther slipped a chick, still covered in yellow feathers, into a small wire cage. In a move that shocked the audience and made the men cry out in surprise, he brought his hand down on the cage, smashing it, and apparently the chick too, leaving nothing but a floating cloud of downy fluff. But then he amazed them all by pulling the chick out from under his floppy hat. Hearty applause followed. He had the audience where he wanted now. They leaned forward in their chairs, the room silent but for the cracking fire, as Gunther summoned water out of a pitcher and shaped it into a shimmering column that floated in the air. It took the form of a swan, before, in a fluid motion, Gunther collected it into a cup, then drank it empty. Haille was impressed and clapped along with the rest of the audience, enjoying the illusions until one sailor raised his pipe to the candle burning in a mountain of wax on his own table. He was trying to give light to the weed stuffed into the bowl of the pipe, when, with a flick of the wrist, Gunther conjured a flame, and the pipe came puffing to life. More applause followed, but Haille's hands were still. The top of his head tingled. He had seen this trick before and knew it to be more than an illusion. Katlyn was mesmerized as she had been in the forest among the elves. Only after Gunther gave a final bow did she turn to her soup. "Could this be real magic too, like the elves?" she asked Val and Cody. Cody shrugged, his eyes not turning away from Misty's as she refilled their mugs. Val cleared his throat.
"Well, it is Carith. The edicts of Hilary Hillborn are not enforced with the same rigor. After all, the elves have magic, and some humans are said to have the gift. But this man could just be a talented illusionist."
That fire was no illusion, Haille thought, wondering if he could find a way to speak to Gunther himself, to ask him what it meant that Sade had told him that he himself had the gift. Misty moved about the tables, refilling mugs with ale, cider, and grog. The patrons broke into a few bawdy songs that Cody knew, and he sang along for a few measures. After the verses, the sailor with the nose ring chained to his earring sauntered over and pulled up a chair. He clapped Cody on the shoulder, looked to do the same to Val, but upon noticing the withering glare the captain gave him, thought better of it.
"Conrad Rumbold is my name. You look new to these parts. Where do you hail from?"
he said in a lilting Corinthian accent.
"Carisans,"
Val answered.
"by way of the sand road." "Ah, most folk these days are headed in the other direction, away from Kerith." A few skirmishes don't scare us, Val said, his fist closing around the handle of his mug. Brave souls you must be. Can't say the same for the refugees flooding up here from the south like lice on a dog. Cowards.
They seemed like families seeking safety to me, Caitlin said, her chin tipped upward. Conrad turned towards her, leaning heavily on his elbow, his smile exposing the brown of his teeth. The chain connecting his nose ring to his earring glittered and swung. Caitlin crinkled her nose as if she could smell his breath.
Well, your heart is as soft as your face is pretty. What is your name, young lady?
I'm sure there are women more of your age who are lining up for your affection, Cody said. His voice was friendly, but there was no missing the edge in it. Maybe let's go meet at the counter over there.
What is your rush, friend? Conrad said. I'm just asking the girl her name. There is nothing like a maiden in the spring of youth.
Cody chuckled uncomfortably and looked across the table to Val, who leaned forward.
This maiden has no more to say to you.
Conrad gave a gruff laugh, reached into his pocket, and pressed a gold capina down onto the table with his thumb, the dirt beneath his nails showing in grimy crescents.
For what I want her for, she doesn't need to talk.
Caitlin's face blanched white, then shifted red. How dare you? Conrad cocked an eyebrow.
You best be controlling your last bear.
Time to go, friend, Cody said, shifting to lift the man out of his chair. He proved not inclined, elbowing Cody in the ribs. Val played cool to his temper.
Easy, friend. She's but a child. She meant no harm.
But Conrad the sailor was in his cups, and Caitlin's rejection had triggered something within him. He reached into his boot and drew out a dagger he had hidden. Cody was too fast, though, grabbing his wrist while Val rose and smashed his mug into the sailor's nose. Chairs scraped across the floorboards, tables flipped. As if a bell had been rung, the room erupted in fighting. With few weapons available, the scuffles turned into a series of wrestling matches, with bodies tangling, men grunting, and cups spilling across the floor. Misty was quickly in the center of things, pulling Haille and Katlyn away from the fray. The burly man with the star-shaped scar remained at the counter, a club in hand, ready to keep the cache of weapons locked away. Longshoremen rushed in the front door, descending on sailors. Both parties went after Val and Cody. When one man raised a bench over his head to strike Cody, Misty stepped in between and stabbed him in the cheek with a fork, giving Cody time to punch him below the belt. "Thanks, milady," he said, flashing a gracious smile to Misty. Haille turned to check on Katlyn, but she was gone. Panicked, he searched the mayhem to see her legs kicking over the shoulders of Conrad as he carried her towards the back door. Haille gave chase, tottering over and falling flat on his face as a chair spun into his path and tripped him. He thumped his chin on the floor and bit his tongue. Stunned for a moment, he struggled up, only to see Conrad disappearing through the doorway. He pushed himself up, dizzy, stumbled around a passed-out, or rather knocked-out patron. A sailor shoved out of the violence collided with him, and they both collapsed in a heap against the wall. Haille fought to lift the man's weight off of him, watching Conrad as he stopped just outside the back door, his head snapping back and his knees buckling. Katlyn began to slide off his tipping shoulders, but her fall was arrested by a tall woman barring the way through the door. Her skin was the color of caramel, her curly black hair pulled back into a ponytail, and a leather headband with animal teeth wrapped her head. Her neck was long and elegant, its shape accentuated by a collar of cowrie shells. Her tunic was oversized, but hugged her body tightly from a series of belts and straps. She wore leather riding breeches and boots flared with tassels. With one arm, she eased Katlyn to the ground. In the other, she held a wood staff, its ends capped with iron bands. "You all right?" she asked Katlyn. Katlyn nodded, leaning against the door jamb, her arms wrapped about her. A goblet shattered on the floor next to her. The woman broke her gaze off from Katlyn and searched the room for the thrower, then sprung into the chaos. Her staff spun like the blades of a windmill, striking, jabbing, and flinging men twice her size. When one moved within the radius of her staff, she stepped up to him and butted him with her head, the teeth of her headband leaving jagged cuts in his forehead. When a chair came flying at her, she knocked it out of the air with the end of her staff, and before she completed the rotation, she landed a blow to a sailor approaching her from behind. She left a trail of bodies across the room, and soon those men still upright were fleeing for the door, where the man with the star-shaped scar looked on with a bemused smile, his arms crossed over his chest, his head shaking. "Fools," he said. One determined fighter swinging a broken table leg had cornered Val by the hearth. Val had nowhere to go, and when he grabbed a fire poker and swung it to meet the man's blow, the poker snapped at the handle. Val stared at the useless piece in his hand before throwing it in the sailor's face. He might have thrown it at a brick wall for the good it did. The sailor lifted the table leg, Val bracing for the shock of the strike, but it never came. The woman with the staff swept the sailor's feet out from under him with one swing. With another, she knocked away the table leg, sending it clattering across the floorboards. Misty picked it up, already undertaking the cleanup process, order having been restored. When the sailor tried to rise, the woman with the caramel skin locked her fierce brown eyes on him and placed her boot on his neck. "Raspar, how many times have I told you? You would regret it if a fight broke out in my establishment." Raspar was too addled or too embarrassed to answer. He coughed and sputtered, rubbing the back of his head, grimacing from the pain. Val, for his part, let out a deep sigh, lowered his arms, and smiled at his rescuer. "Hello, Chloe."